Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one all of the developments are in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians continue offensive operations in the southwestern outskirts of the region, as well as to the east of Pokrovsk and in the northern flank of it. In turn, the Ukrainians' counterattacks have begun, where they have managed to regain some positions in the western and northern parts of the Russian incursion in the rear of Pokrovsk. Meanwhile, Trump and Putin met in Alaska last night. Through it, they spoke for 3 hours, and at the end of it, they took no questions. They seemed happy about the meeting, although no decisive conclusions had taken place or developments had taken place. So we'll have to see over the next few days what media leaks and what additional reports come out from the meeting, but so far we really have nothing on it, besides the fact that Putin looked very happy meeting with Trump. Yesterday I reported on a large amount of Ukrainian reinforcements arriving towards the rear of Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians have sent the first army corps of AFU to stabilize the situation and counterattack. Since then, additional reports have come out from Deep State Map saying they sent the first AFU Army Corps, as was reported yesterday, but also parts of the 79th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades, while 3 assault battalions, 2 mechanized brigades, and 1 marine brigade, as well as the 14th, were already operating in the area. If all of these are fully manned, that would add up to 20,000 soldiers, but in reality it is likely at most 10,000 soldiers. This is what is covering the general area west of Counterattack to the north of Pokrovsk and all the way to the flank of Pokrovsk in the northern flank, while additional forces are defending the city and the western flank. This means that the Ukrainians now have a significant amount of soldiers here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, while the Russian forces only had at most a few hundred soldiers fighting in the northern spearhead. According to the 93rd Brigade, which was fighting on the northern flank, they recorded some video footage of the fighting taking place in Vesele and Hrushke in the northern flank, the very northern outskirts. There was a lot of drone footage where they were striking Russian logistics as well as Russian military personnel within the settlement. From it, I could count 4 casualties and 3 prisoners of war captured within the town, which shows the small concentration of Russian forces that were near the front lines. Although the area was vast and spread out, that is exactly why such few soldiers would be at a low concentration near the front. According to Deep State Map, the Ukrainians launched a multi-pronged counterattack from the northern direction directly head-on to recapture Zoloty Kolityasi, from the Rubishne direction and from the northern direction as well as the Vesele, while at the same time launching additional counterattacks from the Toretsk direction as well as the Vilna direction to cut off the positions near Kucherev Yar and the forest patches on the western flank as well. And again, these are areas not gaining full control over the settlement, but instead located in the forest lines, which indicates that these yet again are a low concentration of forces. Despite this and the clear evidence suggesting that there's a low amount of Russian soldiers, Deep State Map claimed on the basis of an AFU report that the Russians sustained approximately 385 casualties, including prisoners and wounded. This is very interesting because AFU, historically through this war, has been a group that very often releases footage of their claims, footage of their accomplishments. When they were redirected to the Toretsk direction, to the southeast of Counterattack, to stop the Russian advances in the direction of Petrivka and Shcherbinivka, they instantly came out with a lot of videos showing their work, especially since it was mainly a FPV drone brigade. Now they've been rotated to the northern direction, and we have only seen footage from the 93rd, and no footage so far from the AFU brigade that follows up on these claims of almost 400 casualties in such a small area. This reminds me of when the Ukrainians recaptured the settlement, the village of Andrivka to the south of Bakhmut, they claimed they wiped out an entire brigade during the fighting over such a small town, that they encircled and wiped out an brigade entirely within the small town of Andrivka. So we can never trust casualty numbers. And again, this is not just from the Ukrainian side, these are just examples, but from the Russian side, we can't trust these casualty figures either. On top of the developments in the northern outskirts, the Ukrainians also managed to counterattack in the direction of Nikhanorivka, as well as along the railway area. However, here discrepancies between the maps occur because Deep State map never claimed Russian advances beyond Rudinsky and the western flank. Therefore, I'm unclear as to whether the developments took place, in the sense that Zodiac maps just reported an advance by the Russians on the northern flank of Rudinsky. The Russians also hold fortified positions here to the northwest of Rudinsky. On top of that, they've established themselves in the eastern parts of the city. All of this, which is barely or not shown at all within the Deep State map. Generally, the initial advances by the Russians in the northern flank were mostly done by DRG soldiers. They were not the main forces. They were not tasked with establishing themselves. Instead, several of these fortified positions were destroyed by these Russian soldiers. That means they never planned on actually holding on to them, but rather sabotaging them for future offensive operations. The main target has been here on the southwestern parts to gain control over Rudinsky, and we also see an advance by the Russians in the industrial area here east of Mirnorod, gaining control over 2 fortified positions out of 3, as well as half of the industrial area, leaving the remaining parts in a gray zone. So you're seeing the main push of the Russians is to gain control over Rudinsky in the north, which secures cutting off the northern highway, which is one of the main supply lines to Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, and also to establish themselves and secure defensive line in the northern parts, as well as continue offensive operations on the eastern flank near Mirnorod. So we can estimate the initial success of the Ukrainians have been decisive. They've managed to cut off the positions of the Russians in the direction of Kucherevya, Solidyi, Kolidyasi, Vesele, and Hryshke in the northern tip. They've also managed to recapture much of Nikhanorivka and the railway direction to the south of Zoroshne. So the initial success is there. The Russians attempted to ambush the Ukrainian forces and inflict as many casualties as possible during their landings, but after consolidating their positions and landing, that is when these counterattacks begin, exactly as it was when last year on the 9th of August, the Ukrainians launched an MLR strike on the Russian convoy in Rilsk, where they estimated up to 200 casualties from a single standalone event, a mass casualty event, because the Russian convoys were simply standing still. This time around, they were moving and dropping off infantry, unloading infantry. The Russians were ambushing with FPV drones. Both events happened in very different manners, but both of them had the same effect. While unloading, they were struck. Now what we're seeing here is the Russians were ambushing Ukrainian soldiers, and the day after, the Ukrainians are launching their counterattacks and regaining a lot of territory. The exact same thing happened last year. One day, the Russians were hit by an MLRS strike. The next day, their counterattacks had begun and they recaptured significant portions of territory within the Kursk region. So we're seeing yet again, the counterattacks typically happen right after the reinforcements arrive. And it also points to how unreliable this footage is. While this footage shows 100% unequivocal Ukraine takes casualties, Russia does not through this process. That is a small window of opportunity the Russians had to do exactly that, while the scale was not necessary to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians, and certainly not a large enough scale to stop the Ukrainian counterattack. Instead, it might have bought the Russians some time to finish their job, potentially withdraw. We have not received any information from the Russian side with regards to the advances either, like at all, from the Russian advance all the way to the tip near Vesele and Kolidyasi. All of this was not reported. Even Novoshakhova and Nikhanorivka were never claimed to have been captured by the Russian side, nor have we seen geolocated footage of it. But we do see geolocated footage now of the Russians had been present within the Sele, which confirms the deep state map and Ukrainian claims that they were that deep into Ukrainian territory, but they never considered these settlements captured, as they usually report on the captures, which again shows the nature of these operations were not to capture territory, but instead to infiltrate and inflict damage on the fortifications, sabotaging them, and inflicting casualties on the Ukrainians during their rotation. In the end, the true consequences of the rotation and the true test of success for the Ukrainians would be whether they're able to stop the Russian siege of Rodinsky, if they'll be able to push the Russians back across the river line, which the Russian positions across the river line is not very large these days due to the Ukrainian counterattack in the north. That will be the true test, because while they left, the Russians managed to quickly gain success in other areas. So this puts the validity of this rotation to the test. If the Ukrainians are able to push the Russians back across the river line, establish a defensive line there, then they'll be able to rotate forces away from the river line, as they'll need less soldiers to defend these positions, picking up the fortifications and so on, which will allow them to hold the defensive line with fewer soldiers, and the other soldiers can rotate back to where they came from, or to reinforce other sectors of the front line that would need it at that point, or potentially counterattack in the southern flank of Pokrovsk, regain some positions there as well. In that case, it would be a massive success for the Ukrainians and the right choice to rotate these forces. Instead, if the Russians end up putting the Ukrainians on a stalemate and securing their positions, potentially even capturing Rodinsky in the northern flank, the re-entering Minorat in the eastern and southern flanks, and continuing the offensive operations to gain control over both of these cities, then the Ukrainians would be tested, as the Russians would be advancing in other sectors while the Ukrainian forces have been rotated in this direction. That would be a stalemate or a failure, depending on developments in other sectors of the front line and how fast the Russians can advance or the Ukrainians can advance in this area. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians managed to gain control over Alexandrorad here in the western parts. This leaves the Ukrainian positions on the eastern bank of the Volga River line almost entirely eliminated. The Ukrainians just hold their positions near Komushevacha in the southwestern outskirts, as well as the small operationally encircled area north of Novokrenka and Dashne, to which the Russians would hold full control over the border area all the way up to Moravka. Gaining control over Moravka will allow the Russians to have control of the border area all the way up to the Pokrovsk section of the front line. So we're seeing that the Russians almost have completed their operations, gain control over the border area, to which they can start offensive operations to gain control over the two defensive lines in the Zaporizhia region, develop offensive operations towards Olyapole and other logistical hubs within the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions, or to develop offensive operations on the western flank of Pokrovsk towards Novakhlivka, Meshova, Shlovyanka, in the western flank of Pokrovsk, to strengthen the offensive operations towards the cities of Pokrovsk and Minorat. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.